Democrat time.
Hey, still on Cooper time.
All right, we'll call this meeting of the Senate Minerals Economic Development and Business together. We got a lot of rules that we follow, and we'll make sure you follow them. And we'll start with roll call.
Mr. Chairman, this is a roll call vote. Senator Cooper,
Excused.
Senator Jones,
Here.
Senator Nethercutt,
Here.
Senator Rothfuss,
Here.
Chairman Anderson.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
All right, good. All right, we have three bills. We might not get to the third one. I don't know how this will all go, but we'll get through a couple of them today for sure. First one up is HB 202 that we delayed from last week, and I see the guys brought all their props anyway, so that's wonderful. House Bill 202, I think we have somebody here to present it. We do. A representative even. I didn't see any other legislators in the room. I don't think.
It's for the next bill.
Oh, for the next bill? Okay. All right. Go ahead, Representative.
All right, thank you, Chairman and Senators. I bring you the best bill of our session. This is a wonderful bill. It helps out everybody in your neighborhoods. It helps out your small business owners. It helps out everybody there, Mr. Chairman. So with that, I bring you House Bill 202. It's a fast track permit bill. And what I'll kind of run you through the bill and then explain a little bit more as we go. But if we look in just the act on page 1, we can read all the way through there, but I want you guys to notice something that's really important in that. It's permittable zoning use. And a permittable zoning use is something that's already permitted in a certain zone, whether a piece of land. It's already permitted. It's a use that you can use. It's already set by your local municipality, your city, or your county. So it's already something that's a permittable use. So I want to mention that that's very important as we go through this bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, on page 2, 1613-101, these are permitting timelines for development of improved property. It just kind of goes through in this section what a delivery could be, like electronic means such as an email. If a municipality needs to email you and stuff like that, we can use electronic means. Local, on two little I there, local government entity, as we all know, is a body, a city, a town, county political subdivision of the state, including a planning commission or a planning and zoning commission. So not every city and town actually, or every little town has a zoning and planning commission. I think there's like 12 in the whole state. But this is only going to pertain to those who have these departments. Three little I there, the request, I think this is really where it starts getting into one of the main key factors of this bill, folks. It's request means an applicant within a subject's property's permittable zoning use. So that means it's something that's already allowed within that zoning by right, because it's by right, it's your property, for an approval from the local government entity for an action relating to the development or improvement of property, including a building permit or a change of permitting zone use. And when we talk about change of a permitted zone use would be, as an example, Mr. Chairman, would be is if you owned I've been using this the whole time with this bill, so I might as well keep going. If you have a cabinet shop and in a building, and then that cabinet maker decides he's going to retire and you want to lease that building out to, say, a welder. Well, that welder would still most likely be a permitted zoning use. So they're already permitted to go in there. So they wouldn't have to go through a huge, long process of changing zones or anything like that. So that's what that would cover. But the request, and this is where it gets really, really good for everything else, shall not include applications for conditional use permits, rezoning, subdivision permits, subdivision plats, variances, or temporary zoning use. And so what that means, Mr. Chairman, is under that section with three little I, is that this bill itself will not include those. So what we're talking about there is we're talking about something that's a lot more extensive building. So most likely it could have it might be a good for the zoning part, but it's a conditional use inside that zoning. So it'd have to go through a lot longer process of planning, public comment, all these other things in order to get that done. So what we're doing in this bill, Mr. Chairman, is strictly sticking with permittable uses, not the crazy conditional uses or rezoning or subdivision plats. That, Mr. Chairman, on page 3, we're talking about on part B where it says after an applicant submits a request to a local government entity, the local government entity shall provide written notice no later than 15 days after the receipt of the request of the applicant if the applicant's request is complete or incomplete for failing a rule, ordinance, a policy, or of the local government entity. So what that does is if you submit your building plans, your permit, stuff like that, they have 15 days to notify you, and they can do it as with electronic means, which is email, to the applicant. That, hey, you know what? We have an ordinance here or a policy here. We need to change this, right? But it gives them that 15 days to get a hold of the applicant so they're just not sitting there wondering what's going on. So it keeps that local municipality and the applicant talking with one another to make sure this project keeps moving forward. Part C, if the development improved that is the subject of the applicant's request is within the subject property's permitted zone use by right. So it's your property by right, permitted zoning use. The local government entity shall not require meetings related to zoning between the applicant and the local government entity. And that's kind of what I was talking about, is like if you have a cabinet shop and now you want to have a welding shop, but they're both permitted uses, you don't have to go through and notify all your neighbors and do a huge public notice that there's going to be a welding shop opening up in a commercial building that's already a permittable use within that building, if that makes sense. If it's clear as mud, just let me know. Mr. Chairman, also if we go back onto page 4 here, and there is an amendment that I would absolutely love for you guys to put in on this bill. Right after this on section D, it says, after an applicant submits a complete request to the local government entity shall approve or deny the applicant's request no later than 60 days after the date of the completed request is submitted, unless, and that's where this amendment comes in. If you guys would, I would like to put that in. The way it is right now is they have all these unlesses, the applicant and the local government entity agrees in writing of an extension or deadline and all these other things. But if we add this in there, this amendment, it would say the completed request is submitted unless the completed request is returned by the local government entity to the applicant for the applicant to make corrections to the complete request. So what that is allowing the municipality or the local entity to tell whoever has the building permits and the plans that, hey, these certain things need to be changed, resubmit your plans. And that 60 days right there would start over after that. So that way it's not, you already turned in a permit and now they only have 60 days, but then this actually happens, then it would take those days off that 60 days. So this would actually allow it after those corrections are made from the applicant to start the 60 days back over. So that way we're not putting our municipalities in a time crunch when it comes to that. Also, I think, Mr. Chairman, I think the other part of the bill on page 5, I think is any requirements by a local government entity during a plan review of the applicant's requests imposed on the applicant after the applicant's request has been approved shall result in a 10% reduction in applicant's fees. And where this comes from, Mr. Chairman, is right now in these building departments around the state of Wyoming, the municipality has all the power. All the rules fall from the municipality, not the applicant. They are in full control. They're in full control of how fast your project moves forward, how long it's going to take you to do things, when the permitting process, the planning meetings, all that stuff. They have full control. But when you're the applicant and you go through all the hoops and you jump through everything and you do everything right, you dot all your i's, cross all your t's, and that planning department that you've been working with all this time, and you submit that permit and they say, hey, you're good to go. Everything looks great. And you go to work and you start building. What happens is you call in for inspections as you're building, because a lot of times they're rolling inspections. And you call that, for an inspection, they come out and they say, we, as a municipality, missed something. We forgot to tell you that you might need to do this, or wait a minute, the code actually says this. So we need you to change this on your project. When that happens, a lot of times the applicant could have to go back to their engineering, architects, spend a lot more money, materials, labor, and all those different things. So again, if that happens the way it is right now, all those costs are bared by the applicant, even though they did everything they were supposed to do. But now we have this, so what it is a 10% permit fee that comes back to the applicant. And what that does is it allows, when a building department has to submit to their local elected officials that, hey, we messed up and we need you to approve paying this person back 10% of their fees, then it gets those local elected officials going, hey, do we have a problem here or not? Now, if they see one or two a month, they're probably not gonna say anything. Everybody has an off day. There's no doubt about it. But if it's happening 5 or 6 a day, it allows those local elected officials to look at their building department and say, hey, what do we gotta do here to fix this? Because a lot of times I think your local elected officials don't know every little aspect of what actually goes on in that department. So with that, Mr.
Representative Feiler,
Yes, sir. Yes.
I've decided I'm not gonna let you read page 6.
Okay. It's on page 6. Oh, good. I wouldn't either.
Okay.
But Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions. I know there's gonna be some concern possibly about, I believe it's on page 4. Because I heard that this afternoon before you all came in from the municipalities regarding state and federal agencies. I think it's on page 4, starting on line 11. An applicant's request requires approval of a state or federal agency. If the applicant's request requires an approval by the state or a federal agency, then the deadline shall be extended for not more than an additional 10 days unless the applicant and the local government entity agree in writing to an alternative deadline. The reason why I had this in there, Mr. Chairman, is if a federal agency or a state agency has some dealings with your building permit or your project, we all understand that those things could take a while, right? We're a lot bigger government, a lot more hoops to jump through on that side. But what it says is that we're gonna extend that deadline for the municipalities 10 extra days to notify you, is what that does. So within that 10 days, the municipality notifies the applicant and says, hey, we gotta go through this federal agency or this state agency, and it's gonna take a lot longer. Well, that at least allows that communication between the applicant and the municipality, because right now, there's nothing that states that they even have to get a hold of you. They can just sit on your permit. So this tells them, hey, you got 10 days. Notify that applicant. You guys come together. Let's find out a real timeline, because that contractor or that builder might have contractors lined up, ready to go to work on a certain date, and they might even be paying these folks. But guess what? Now the deadline is gonna have to move. And if the applicant says, I don't agree in writing, I don't care, I'm not doing this, I don't agree with this, well, then obviously that's gonna fall back under the applicants not doing what their due diligence in order to get their permit to go forward, and they could probably deny their project. But I would believe that 99.9% of developers or an applicant would go along with the municipality and work together to find out a true deadline, so that way they could schedule everything correctly. So that's why that's in there, but I know there's gonna be some concern about that, so I thought I'd bring that up. Other than that, Mr. Chairman, I know it's a whole lot that we're learning about building permits and stuff, but if you have any questions, I'd sure love to answer them.
Any questions for Representative Feiler? Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the discussion on page 4 about the applicant's request requires approval by a state or federal agency. When we look at request is very specific to the building permit or change a permitted zoning use. Neither of those things will ever require a state or federal agency to approve it. The project will require potentially substantial approval, permitting, whatever else, you know, you go through DEQ, you go through EPA, you've got all these, but to my knowledge, you know, a federal agency never steps in on a local building permit and says, whoa, you know, we're the federal government, we're here to help. So I feel like the structure of that, I understand the intent, but doesn't it seem like the structure of that is a little bit off?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Feiler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rothfuss, I agree. I would agree about, this is something that is so rare that would ever happen. But I think it's one of the reasons why I think we put it in there, because of that one rare instance where it could be, maybe you're wanting to build 3 or 4 houses and it could be a DEQ problem or something like that, that they might have to. And what would happen is the municipality would know about that too, because if you have your grade studies and all these different things, there might be something missing there that the municipality might require DEQ to do. So they might have to reach out to that state agency. So what that does is it gives them that extra 10 days to get a hold of you saying, hey, we had to reach out to them. They have issues with this. We need to work with them on this project. But you're absolutely correct, Senator Rothfuss. And I think that's the only reason why we had that section in there. But you're right, 99.9% of your projects will probably never have to fall under this.
But, Mr. Chairman, that wasn't exactly the point. The point was that they do often require federal approval or state agency approval. It's just that it's not a part of the building permit process. It's a part of other licensing and permitting processes. So the phrasing there that the request requires approval seems overly narrow, where again, and I could be wrong, I'm not exactly an expert on building permits. We have some in the room, so, you know, by all means, tell me I'm wrong if I am. But it would just be my expectation that the building permit would be a local decision process made pursuant to code, and they're not looking out for federal or state, they're looking to the local building code, while federal state permitting might be extensive and take place. And so I guess I'm just wondering
Mr. Chairman?
if that's hitting the mark.
Senator Ethicott.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think probably what the purpose of this is that if there are extenuating circumstances that would interfere with the timeline of the project based on state or federal issues, right? That the city is not subject, the municipality wouldn't be subject to these deadlines. I appreciate the 10-day extension there, but that generally would be the purpose, right?
Yes.
Chairman,
Senator Feiler.
Senator Nethercott, you're correct, yes.
Other questions for Representative Feiler? Other questions? Other questions? Hearing none? Thank you, Representative Feiler. I'm glad you didn't read that page 6. Any agencies like to talk about this good little bill of Representative Feiler's House Bill 262? Any agency? Hearing none? Anyone in the room like to talk about this good little bill? And there is.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I'm Bob McLaurin. I'm with the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. We appreciate Representative Feiler bringing this bill. As he indicated previously, we have some concerns with it. But I wanted to say up front that we as the municipalities and the building departments around the state understand that people need to have expectations about processes. You know, when is it reasonable to get a building permit? How long should it take? And we can expect to be held accountable to those deadlines. And so we do appreciate the intent of this bill. We do have some concerns because while the bill itself is limited to by right uses, you know, and excludes, you know, conditional use permits, variances, et cetera, it doesn't really speak to the complexity. Even a by right building, a use by right can have a very, very complex set of plans, and my colleague here will talk about that in a minute. But we do, so our principal request of this bill is and I had talked to Senator Cooper, and I don't know if he left a proposed amendment or not with you, but we had suggested an amendment to the bill on page 2 that would essentially limit it to residential construction. And on line 21, page 2, we would propose
It's your theme music. Mr. McLaurin.
we would propose
You got help, Bob. You got help. You got
I
help.
need
They're
some, Mr.
calling in.
Chairman, I need some. On page 2, line 21, we would propose inserting after A, the word residential. And after permit, insert a period, and then delete the rest of that line. We believe that would limit this 60-day deadline to residential construction. So it would not exclude the bigger, more complex projects. With respect to, on page, and we agree with the, on page 4, the proposed amendment by Representative Filer. We like that. On page 5, section G, if I read that correctly, so if the municipality fails to issue the permit within a 60-day period, the permit's deemed approved, but should be subject to all health and safety inspections. Well, you're building a building without a permit, so I'm not sure how you're going to inspect that. I think that creates some uncertainty there. How we would inspect it, I'm not sure. I raised that point.
Bobby, are you saying that you have to have a permit to have an inspection?
I'm going to let my colleague from the city of Cheyenne address that, but that's my understanding that what are we inspecting it against? I mean, obviously a set of plans have been submitted, but they haven't been approved. Are you submitting it on the stuff that you have in hand? So I just think it creates some uncertainty. And the last thing I'd say is we spent the last 2 summers in the Regulatory Reduction Task Force, and we had a bill that didn't quite make it out, that we were close on. And but anyway, having said that, this is Tono. He's the building official from the city of Cheyenne, and I think he has a couple comments to make to the committee, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Any questions for Bob before we let him get away? Any questions? Any questions? Seeing none, thank you, Bob. Can you make it work?
Mr. Chair, yes, sir. Again, my name is Anthony Parmelo. I'm currently serving as a building official for the city of Cheyenne. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I think it's important that for reference matters or purposes, we understand that's the plan size that would typically be submitted to our department for a residential house that I've set up here in front of the microphone. The props that I've brought in here for the last 2 meetings for your observation, this would represent the size of plan sets that we have for our largest projects, which are data centers that we have currently. We have sites or campuses that we call them that have 9 data centers on them currently. We have others that have 4 in work, and ultimately we'll end up with approximately 9 to 10 as well. Those 2 boxes represent one set of plans for one building on said campus. That is a lot of work to review that from just a building permit standpoint, much less to start to talk about the zoning and planning and engineering and drainage functions that go into these processes as well.
One building on one campus? How many buildings on campus?
Up to 9 on some of the campuses we currently have, and I'm speaking about the Cheyenne area, sir. I'm not obviously able to speak to all projects that are going in all jurisdictions across our state, which this bill is going to affect every jurisdiction across the state. Workloads vary differently, building department sizes, planning department sizes, engineering department sizes vary different, are very drastically different.
Question, we have a question, Anthony.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And just for your understanding, knowing that you're new to testifying in front of the committee, we understand those differences across Wyoming as we represent communities other than Cheyenne. Appreciate that you've brought what would be one of the most complicated building permits that the city probably has seen or sees in any kind of regular basis. So I appreciate that, understand the large campus south of town. That said, what we're also hearing is a concern from a community member. God, I'm the only Cheyenne legislator here, that evidently has experienced some frustration with the process. And so do you think that there is some type of compromise that can be reached with a threshold? So the Wyoming Association of Municipalities has proposed limiting it to residential. That seems unsatisfactory to the purpose of what the bringer of the bill wants or what those concerns may be. And so understanding that not everything is going to be related to Meta and large data projects, is there some type of compromise between the most complicated that we see and your local landowner who's a small business owner that wants to add on the paint shop with the welding shop or whatever the case may be? And so is there some other kind of middle road that we can identify?
Mr. Chairman,
Anthony?
may I ask?
Bob, you're doing it, all right?
I absolutely, Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, absolutely. And I think the bill that we worked on in regulatory reduction worked towards that, but we want to be cooperative, we want to be constructive, we want to provide good customer service. So we're more than willing to sit down and negotiate, some different, maybe residential is 45 days instead of 60, and there's a 120-day threshold for this size building and something for bigger buildings. I'm happy to have that conversation.
Yes, Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, would that project be an example of just a permitted use, or is that a conditional use permit would be needed for that type of project?
Mr.
Anthony,
Chairman.
go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, through you, Senator Jones. Ma'am, this could be both. It depends. We currently, North Range Business Park that we have here for one of our Microsoft campuses just annexed. So there was some zone changes that happened to that to change that zoning use there for the whole park. If it's a new piece of property that comes in, there can be some rezoning that has to happen. So conditional use could come into play. But most oftentimes what I'm familiar with is that these are permitted uses once a zone change happens. So a subsequent permit that would be applied for would now be considered that permitted use.
Follow-up? No? Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I kind of wanted to follow up on that. The conditional use, do you process the building permit and the conditional use permit in parallel, or do you process those in series where you have to get the conditional use permit first? That whole process has to finish, and then you would start on the building permit.
Mr. Chair,
Go
through
ahead.
you to Senator Rothfuss. The city of Cheyenne currently does allow for concurrent processing. I will confess, I am not the individual that's responsible for permitted uses or for conditional uses. That's our planning department. They would speak much more eloquently to their processes. But for the projects that are in front of you, we do allow them to be concurrent.
So, Mr. Chairman, how long would that project take for the building permit? I'm assuming that in that, if you have a conditional use permit, you probably start the process for the conditional use permit, you start the building permit process. How much time ends up going into this type of a project?
For the review of these data centers, our department has become pretty proficient at those. Currently, we can get to those within the 30 days. But that is front to back, perfect plans, no road bumps, no speed bumps, no issues. new data centers coming in, which are always doing that. We have to start that process over again, so it takes us a little bit longer time to get those reviewed. There is a lot of communication back and forth. So there was an amendment, I think, about it only being in the building department's hands, and then once it was placed back to the applicant, that didn't keep that clock going, so to speak. That can work. That some kind of nuance within the bill would be workable for sure.
Understood. Thank you.
Other questions? For the Cheyenne and Wham? No other questions? Thank you, Cheyenne and Wham.
I had one more thing, Mr.
Oh.
Chairman, if I may, I apologize.
You're not done.
No, sir.
Oh, okay, all
Mr.
right.
Chairman, I wanted
Go
to
ahead.
just briefly speak, if I could, to the state and federal discussion that was brought up.
Yeah,
The question was posed that maybe there could be some input on that. It is actually absolutely correct that federal agencies are rarely involved. In fact, I can't say that I've been involved in a building permit in my 20 years of doing this that has had a federal overtone to them. But I can tell you that there are state overtones that happen quite frequently. Jurisdictions are not always, as the city of Cheyenne is, having full jurisdiction over fire and every other building code. Some jurisdictions only have jurisdiction over building code and fire code, and sometimes even electrical code are handled at a state level. So there is joint ventures that come into play here. So the state aspect of this would and can be and will be problematic. In the 10 days, as written, to me, is going to be very difficult for some of our much smaller jurisdictions, absolutely.
you know, I think there was an instance where the federal guys got into a subdivision and it had something to do with a leaping frog or a leaping toad or something like that, and they stopped the project, I think maybe in either Laramie or Cheyenne. I was thinking it was.
Do we have toads?
Mr. Chairman, did they stop the building permit aspect though, or
Yeah.
did they stop, I mean, because they stop projects all the time. There's no
Stopped the
question
whole
they'll stop
project.
Projects, but I
Stopped
can't,
the whole project for years.
right.
And then it died.
But I can't imagine they inserted themselves, and I could be wrong, I just can't imagine they inserted themselves into the building permit process. I would expect them to come in through any one of the many federal laws that allows them to just say, whoa.
Yeah. All right, well, maybe I'm wrong about the leaping frog or whatever it was. Yeah, yeah, something like that. All right, you're finished? Are we finished with you? Any more questions for?
Keep them all close by.
All right, thank you. Anyone else like to speak about House Bill 202? Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
We're trying to divide, make it look like they're not all from the same area.
Yeah, yeah.
Cheyenne's doing the same.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, it's good to see you all. I'm Andy Schwartz. I represent the town of Jackson. Serendipitously, I had comments prepared, but the mayor of Jackson is now in town. So Arne Jorgensen, I will defer to Mr. Jorgensen to begin our comments, and then I might have some comments after he's done, with the permission of the chair.
We'll see, yeah.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Chair Committee. Arne Jorgensen, Mayor of Jackson, very much appreciate being here. And I just have to start this by Representative Filer and I first met literally yesterday, and I've really enjoyed the interactions and really look forward to, and I mean that seriously. I'm hearing laughs behind me. I mean that very seriously. Exactly. So, yeah, give it time. But I really do want to say that with all sincerity, and the comments made earlier about really taking these comments seriously and these issues raised very seriously and looking to find solutions that address some of the concerns, wholeheartedly agree with that. The town of Jackson is very proud of our land development regulations and our timeframe. We have timeframes in there and we hold people accountable to those. We take that very, very seriously. And I think at the end of the day, and most of you heard me say versions of this in the past, local control is important. You know, when our processes fail, we hear about it. I hear about it in the grocery store. I hear about it when I'm walking around town. And I just want to reiterate that. We take it seriously and we act on it. I will just reinforce the comments about, in our community, this would be a couple of hundred thousand square foot hotel, which is literally beginning to work through our planning office right now, would begin to look like that at a building permit phase. Our residential probably get a little bit bigger than this, but I just want to, they're not the same. And I think that distinction is really important. So I just, on the very high level, we're here to be part of the solution and very much looking forward to that. I do, before Andy corrects something I'm saying, there is, listening to the dialogue here, and this, I didn't really realize this until I heard Representative Filer, the focus on this seems to be building permit after the planning reviews are done. On page 2, line 21, where it talks about the definition of request, it talks about improvement of property, including a building permit. And I do have this may be a detail, but I have a concern about making sure this doesn't get interpreted to be a zoning review. So our as-of-right zoning permits do require, based on the scale, many of them require planning commission, design review committees, town council reviews. Much of the discussion we're having about building permits, I'm very comfortable having a discussion about that. But when it says including, does that suggest that it may be more broad than that? And so I just want to call the committee's attention to that. I don't have any suggestion. I suspect, as Wham's testimony was talking about, we could work through that issue pretty quickly, I think, with Representative Filer and others that are interested in these issues. So with that, I would stand for questions and just very much appreciate this.
Question for the mayor. Question for the mayor. Hearing none? Oh, we have one. Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mayor, I recall that there was a subdivision that was testifying in front of I guess a builder that was trying to do a subdivision, that was testifying in front of Regulatory Reduction Task Force. And I was thinking that they were saying that maybe your processes were super long, and I'm trying to refresh my memory on those testimonies, but I was thinking that they've been put off and put off and put off. And so then I also thought that maybe this is one of the reasons for bills such as this.
Chair, Senator, through the chair, if I may, I suspect that you're referring to a large project that's been proposed in the county, which I cannot speak to for obvious reasons. And in the town of Jackson, and I think you raised the point I raised about page 2, if it's a subdivision planning level review, then I don't get the sense that this is an intent. We do have limits in our land development regulations for those kind of projects, and we take that very seriously in the town of Jackson. But I think specifically, if I remember those discussions in that task force, that was referring to a project in the county. And I think Andy attended more of those than I did, or Mr. Schwartz attended that. So, but more than happy to dive into some of those details if necessary. Thank you.
Okay. We don't have any more questions for you. Well, I didn't know if I wanted to hear from him. Okay, Schwartz, go ahead.
Thank you,
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Nethercott for giving me this opportunity. I have a couple things I'd like to say. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Senator Jones, I am aware of that project. I could later on discuss it with you in more detail. That gentleman actually had received a building permit many years before he testified and never actually closed the deal. So his testimony, he did spend many years trying to get a project built, but I think implying that it was because of delays by the town building and planning department might not be an accurate description. So that to address that point, I do have one other point I'd like to bring up, and that would be on page 5, sections F and G. Because section F, it starts out by saying any requirements missed. It's not very specific what missing a requirement entails. But then it says there'll be this 10% reduction in fee, which I kind of have a little bit of an objection to. The sponsor of the bill implied that the only way local elected officials would be aware of these problems is by reviewing vouchers. Having spent 12 years both dealing with developments and reviewing vouchers, I don't think that's an accurate description of how local government functions. And I will echo the words of the mayor. When you're a local official and you go to the grocery store or the bank or anywhere, trust me, they find you and they will let you know when there's been a delay in their building permit. And then as you go on, so there's that 10%, but then when you go to G, very accurately says, nonetheless, you can't get a certificate of occupancy regardless of what has happened prior until it meets the code. So I don't have a specific amendment in my mind, but it seems that this makes it actually, if we're trying to make things easier to process, this adds complication in my mind. And having said that, I'll stand for any questions.
Questions for Mr. Schwartz? Questions for Mr. Schwartz, a skier from Jackson? No?
I'm
No
getting
questions?
nervous.
No questions. Thanks. Yes, Mayor.
Chairman, I just realized I may have misspoke in the how I'm supposed to present things, listening to my good friend here. I was representing to the bringer of this by his formal name, and maybe I'm not supposed to do that, and I should have referenced him as bringer of the, so if I missed up there, I apologize.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, okay.
You're good. We allow that here.
Okay.
We use any name we can come up with. Fact. Wait a minute, we have one question here.
No.
Oh, no? Oh. Okay, all right, thank you. Anyone else like to speak on House Bill 202? Yes, sir, state your name and rank and serial number.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Mayor Patrick Collins from the city of Cheyenne. I hadn't planned on speaking today, I just came to listen to the arguments, but on page 5, lines 4, there's this reference to if the city misses something on plan review, then there should be a 10% discount given to the folks who brought the building permit to us. And I'm wondering whose responsibility it is to have this permit correct. So we get building permits from our.
It's the mayor's.
Well, when I'm in the grocery store, sir, that's exactly right. But in the planning department, these building plans come from architects, they come from engineers, they're licensed, and they're responsible to know the codes. So the codes come to us from international building codes, the state adopts them, and then within 6 months, we're required by law to adopt them, and if we don't, then the state takes over the responsibility for the things that we're supposed to do. And so they bring us the plans, and we look over those plans to make sure. But, if something is missed, whose responsibility is it? Is it our responsibility or is it their responsibility? And my concern is that if we leave this in, our staffs are going to want to take every dang minute they can to make sure they have not missed anything. And we're trying to get things out fast to be customer service friendly. I'm a little bit nervous about that part of it. And again, I don't think it's my staff's responsibility to do their job for them. So if they missed something, then they should be responsible to their client for what happens. So I think that part is probably not something that should be in this law. And the second thing is, my chief building official, Tono, talked about this plan set here, and it talks about, he could maybe get those done in 30 to 60 days. And I appreciate that, but we do about 4,000 building permits a year in Cheyenne. And so it's a busy department. It's all hands on deck to do that in 30 to 60 days. But in that time frame, we've had maybe 100 other building permits come in. And so, what do? We can either get that one done, or we're going to have a bunch of other ones stacked up behind them. And so I like the idea of this maybe starting off as a residential responsibility. Maybe we can study a better way to move forward on commercial in the future. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Mayor, do you think the timelines are too tight? Is that what you're saying? The 30 days and the timeline things are too tight, or?
Mr. Chairman, to do a single-family home or duplex like this, I think 60 days is more than adequate to do that. To do something like that, I was just in Pinedale for our Wyoming Association of Municipalities, was it last summer for their meeting? They're building a new hospital there. It's beautiful. I'm just not sure they would have the capability of doing all the work on a project like that in 60 days. It's a lot. Healthcare facilities are really challenging. And I'm not sure that I don't believe 60 days on challenging commercial projects is enough to do a good job on those things. And so maybe the first step, the baby step would be residential. We can study this over the interim and try to figure out a way to do the commercial stuff in a timely manner.
Yes. Senator Rothfuss.
Obviously, residential is a clear category.
Fix it.
What other categories are there? Are there a diversity of categories, like commercial 1, commercial 2, anything along those lines? Vast, how many different categories do you have, and is that standardized across the state? Do you know?
Mr. Chairman, through you, honestly, sir, I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I'm just thinking about, we have heavy industrial projects that come.
Yeah.
That might be like a new hydrogen plant that might come, that might be very complicated, a project. We have healthcare facilities. In your city, you have new dormitories being built, and, and again, those are, they're big and they're very complicated. And, I just don't know if we have the capabilities in all of our communities to meet those needs in 60 days.
Mr. Chairman, Mayor, I was just thinking, are there any other categories that are like residential that sort of fall into the simple category?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, through you. I think single-family home duplexes, triplexes, that missing middle type of housing definitely are things that I think most jurisdictions could handle in that 60-day timeline.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions for the mayor of the city? The chocolate bringer. Yeah. All right, thank you, Mayor. All right, next.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Jeff Darty here on behalf of FGA, speaking in favor of the measure before you. So quickly, I just wanted to let this body know, for about 15 years of my life, I spent as a planning director. And so please know that a lot of the people who have testified so far and people who have not testified, I work with them. I can tell you they are wonderful people who aspire every single day to leave their communities better than they found them. They do not stay up late at night trying to find ways to torture applicants. They do precisely the opposite. But that said, I do agree with Representative Filer that this could be the best bill you see this session, in that it does tend to take a step in the right direction. It certainly doesn't solve all of the problems. I think the jurisdictions have brought up serious and important concerns for discussion, but I would tell you this, that sometimes jurisdictions, their staff get submittals that are not well thought out. They're just poorly put together, and the staff have to do what we call redlining them into compliance, and that takes time. But I would tell you that, in my opinion, that application you see right there is a conditional use. It is not the intent of this bill to capture that and to put the planning and the building staff in a terrible position trying to make a conditional use permit scale of structure subject. This is intended, Mr. Chairman, you asked a question earlier, this is intended for simple uses. In an industrial park, already platted, cabinet shop versus welding shop. This is not intended for hospitals, hotels, or other intensive uses that would put the staff in a difficult situation.
Mr. Chairman?
Question here.
Mr. Doherty, thank you. Where in the bill is it identified as a simple use?
It doesn't, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Senator Nethercott, it doesn't identify it as a simple use. What it does is it identifies it as a permitted use, which are usually uses that are of the lowest intensity within the zoning district.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But it applies to all uses within that zoning district. And so I know we want it to be simple, but the law that we're creating does not distinguish that. So do you have proposed language that would help distinguish that from a 9-building meta park versus the cabinet shop wanting the paint shop guy?
Chair Anderson?
Yes.
Senator Nethercott, my hope is, in working with the sponsor of this bill and working with LSO, The goal was to use the language permitted use, which is a very narrow category within their zoning regulations. There are lists of uses. Single-family house in a residential zone, cabinet shop in an industrial zone. And then in the right column are your conditional uses, which are hotels, multifamily, beyond a fourplex and above, type uses that are not, they're outside the reach. And so that, Senator, that's how we tried to get to where we are, is by limiting it strictly to permitted uses.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
so you disagree with the testimony provided already that this bill applies to non-simple uses?
Chairman Anderson,
Yes.
Senator Nethercott, it's not that I disagree. I maybe have a different perspective on the truth. But what I would say to you is it was never the intent of this bill to capture conditional uses for hotels, data centers, or anything else within the context of this bill.
Is that it?
I have more.
Oh,
I'm just making
got a
sure there are no
question
more
here.
questions.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, and that therein lies the challenge that the legislation does capture all of those things, even if that wasn't the intent. And I'm scurrying to try and figure out how to fix that and struggling. Do you have any specific suggestions that would try to narrow it to that intent?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rothfuss, at a fundamental level, as you've heard in the previous testimony, the easiest way for that to move forward today is to focus on residential uses. It sounds like the mayor and other individuals are willing to work with us on coming up with better language for the commercial and industrial uses. I don't know that the sponsor would love that. He's probably shaking his head vigorously behind me, but and it was never my aspiration to put the sponsor into tears today. But I will tell you that residential uses up to three plexes, I can't remember if it's a threeplex or a fourplex where it triggers a different section in the code that becomes much more intense. But perhaps residential uses up to that three or fourplex, we can, would be a great starting point, Senator.
More questions? Mr. Jardy, more questions? More questions? Nope.
Can I add just a couple more final thoughts, Mr. Chairman? And
You can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the bottom line is, I want to point out that why this is important. It's important because it establishes a predictable timeline. It was intentionally developed in consort with a number of jurisdictions around the state, finding out what their typical timeline is for reviewing these and then setting it at double that timeline so that there was plenty of room.
Mr. Chairman,
Question here.
Mr. Doherty,
Yes.
which jurisdictions are you in concert with?
I've spoken with the planning department from this jurisdiction that we're in here and from the county jurisdiction here.
So, Mr. Chairman, when you say in concert, you've just verified timelines? Because they don't support the bill, I don't think.
The associations have different, what,
ahead,
Mr.
go
Chairman,
ahead.
Senator Nethercott, my goal was to visit with them to understand what the typical review time is for building permits. And in previous research efforts, I've also checked with Sheridan, Natrona, Teton, and other counties around the state in order to understand what their review timelines are for a building permit on a residential.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so the goal here is to have a predictable and efficient permitting timeline, to also encourage applicants to submit complete applications. It puts jurisdictions in a tough spot when they get applications and plan sets that are not thoroughly prepared. And it also creates accountability, which is a key goal of not trying to be punitive against the jurisdictions, which is why the 10% number in there, they're never an aspiration to be punitive, simply an aspiration to try to bring it to the attention of the elected officials who are the ones that are ultimately responsible to the voters and have the ability to help cause changes in the permitting process. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm going to conclude my comments there.
Okay, all right, thank you. We already questioned you quite a bit, so we're going to let you go.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else like to speak on this? Good little bill. House Bill 202. Jesus Christ. Okay, Jeremiah, go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. You've heard a lot of testimony. I'll try and be brief. I sat through 2 legislative interims trying to find a good process for us to move forward and encouraging counties to establish notification, deadlines, timelines, and make sure that those were well published. In the course of the last part of the Regulatory Reduction Task Force, in October of last year, they were considering at least 3 concepts of this particular approach. Trying to get that to a finish line, and Senator Jones can speak to this as well. I sat down with the planners and the municipal folks and our team and rewrote one of those versions and brought that back to the task force. And save for the fact that they didn't have a quorum for that meeting, that legislation isn't before you this session. That's something that we would support. It required us to establish notification. It required us to set deadlines and to clearly publish those, both on our website and elsewhere. It also provided for appeal process through the governing body, so for counties, of course, through the county commissioners, and for judicial injunction if we weren't meeting deadlines. Again, unfortunately, that legislation isn't here before you. We would support that. This is legislation that we do not support for all of the reasons that you've heard today, and I'll let the planners that are online speak to the more technical components of this and correct the record that's been corrected. But there are issues for us. You've heard about commercial, you've heard about some of the punitive natures of this. We just, at this point in time, can't support this legislation and would ask that you not move it forward.
Questions for Jeremiah? Yes, go ahead. Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say that it sounds like we didn't show up for that meeting, but I just wanted to say that it was kind of a last minute added on meeting at the end. So unfortunately, a lot of the members of the regulatory task force were not able to make it. So we were unable to finish some of our legislation. Wouldn't you agree? That's my question.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Jones is absolutely correct. It really fell on top of a lot of us very quickly. Unfortunately, I think we could have accomplished some good things at the end there.
Is this as big an issue for the counties as it is for the cities? It seems like the cities might have more building permits than the counties, but I don't know that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you heard testimony about the number of jurisdictions. I actually put together a complete spreadsheet of all of this. I'd be happy to provide it for you of what jurisdictions the counties have put in place for this particular issue. About half the counties have some sort of planning and zoning in place. Some of them are well-staffed. Some of them are not well-staffed at all. If you look at Sublette County as an example, I think they have a half-time planner. And I think that they're meeting the deadlines that are before them right now. But if we, start to put too much structure here, it could be problematic for them and require them to hire more staff and go through additional expense that's unnecessary.
Other questions for Jeremiah? Hearing none, thank you, Jeremiah. Thanks for being with us today. More testimony in the room. More testimony in the room. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Nick Agopian, I represent the Teton County Board of County Commissioners. And today we're standing in opposition to this bill as it currently sits. I think for all of the reasons to save the committee time that you've already heard from the others that have testified in opposition to this bill, and drawing your attention to the idea that we've heard about narrowing this to residential as a first step to look at. To be clear, at my county, for my county, it's my understanding that this would reduce permitting times on residential homes by 1/3, where we're currently at 90 days. This would take it down to 60. That's something that we would have to manage and deal with, and it It's unclear yet what we would do, but a lot of times for our county, we're having to utilize third-party reviewers because we don't have enough staff to get through all of the permitting applications. And I think one thing that may be valuable to talk about as well is just the idea that this bill presents is a good idea. It is what we talked about as it relates to the Regulatory Reduction Task Force. How do you permit something that is a complete permit? The changes of use, the changes of zoning, the conditional use permits, which this bill identifies are not included. We're talking about when you submit your permit, what's a reasonable time frame? And I think that's a good discussion to have. Where we were going with the regulatory reduction, as Mr. Riemann identified, was staying consistent with the current statutory framework that I believe we have here in Wyoming that delegates this authority to local entities, either at the county or the municipal level, and allows them to determine what is an appropriate time frame based on their staffing. How do we give our community, our citizens, a reasonable expectation? And then in that idea too, it did include a penalty, where if we don't follow it, there is a penalty associated with that. I think as it relates, maybe one other comment would be, as we look at page 2, line 21, the change of permitted zoning use, and then you go next to subsection C at the bottom of page 3, starting at line 16. It says that if you're the permitted zoning use by right, you may, that use by right is a category, or there's several things that could occur. So the example of a cabinet maker or a cabinet shop and a fabrication shop, and switching between those two, that I understand. But if you are in an industrial park and you go from a permitted use that's a fabrication shop, and then let's say you open up a supply house, you've just changed the whole traffic dynamic. And so this bill would not require, if your current county process required you to notify your neighbors because your county or your town requires a use permit for your building, and you don't notify your neighbors, and even though it's a use by right, if you're changing some of those components, it seems like you would want to retain that notification component. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions. I want to be
Questions
brief.
for the Teton County representative? Questions for the Teton County rep?
Is there anyone else from Teton County that's elected, has been elected, represents Teton County? Please raise your hand.
All right, thank you, Nick. Thank you. Anyone else in the room would like to speak on House Bill 202? House Bill 202. Hearing none, we have a couple on the Zoom. Do we have them up, Sue?
Mr. Chairman, I have one. Melissa?
Melissa? Okay. Melissa, can you hear us? I hope you're brief.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Great. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Melissa Ruth, speaking on behalf of the Wyoming Planning Association, abbreviated as WyoPass. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on this bill. And I won't repeat what's been said. As a board, we did work through a number of revisions that we would like to see to this bill if it does move forward. But ultimately, we stand in opposition to this bill for a number of reasons that have been stated. But to correct the record, as Mr. Ryman from WCCA stated, this does not affect only 12 communities. This affects any community, city or county that has zoning regulations. There's 12 counties alone. So then every other state, and as some are well-staffed, some are not. Looking at the uses and this conversation regarding use by right versus conditional use. In theory, conditional uses, yes, are supposed to be simpler uses, but I specialize in land use code writing. And I can tell you for a fact, as I have a number of city and county regulations open on my computer, data centers are a permitted use by right in 3 zone districts in the city of Cheyenne. Data centers are a permitted use by right in 8 out of the 9 zone districts in Albany County, and hospitals are a permitted use by right in almost every zone district statewide. So when you're looking at these large building permit sets, those are still permitted uses. The reason a use is a permitted use versus a conditional use is not because the use is quote unquote simple, it is because the use aligns with what the community wants to see in that area. That doesn't mean the use is easy. Communities might say we want to see certain types of development in this area, but there's still additional standards or things that maybe make that use a little bit more complicated. I've provided a number of different testimonies with the RTF and working with that bill that was proposed, and I think we did move in the right direction with that one. And we, as YOPAS and myself, are happy to work with the proposer of this bill to get this right. Right now, we feel this bill is not ready for prime time, as evidenced by all of the questions and comments today. We would like the opportunity to work collaboratively to make sure this bill is, and whatever regulations we put forth, are right-sized for the state of Wyoming. There is not another state that has a bill similar to this. The state of Utah has a bill that has building permit timelines, but it is specific for residential. It does not even discuss commercial or industrial uses at all. It also specifically eliminates any building permit that would require a third-party review based off of highlighting a lot of the conversations that has been had. So I won't repeat the number of amendments that I had unless there's questions about them, but I'll stand for any questions.
All right. Questions for Melissa? Questions for Melissa? Seeing none, thank you, Melissa, for your testimony. We appreciate it. Next up.
Mr. Chairman, that's everyone on this bill.
Oh, that's all? Oh, okay. Okay, then that closes public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Bill's been moved. Bill's been moved. Is there a second? Is there a second? Bill's been moved. Is there a second? Hearing none, we'll lay this bill back into inactive status. And it looks to me like there's a little work to be done by some of the organizations. Maybe it can be an interim subject. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move right on to House Bill 209, carbon capture mandate repeal. The hell did I do with it? Jesus Christ. I thought I saw it here. Representative Knapp, are you ready for House Bill 209?
Mr. Chairman, yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, before you today is House Bill 209, which is a repeal of the mandate for carbon sequestration. Trump has declared a national energy emergency, and in that includes deregulation, infrastructure investments, incentives for coal companies to reopen shuttered mines. The Supreme Court rulings against the EPA from writing or interpretation of law and giving that back to the courts is a reversal of the Chevron doctrine. And I believe it's time for Wyoming to take its place as a leader in energy. We need to take full advantage of this administration and the Supreme Court rulings to unleash our energy and take the chains off. Mandated regulations add unneeded burden onto the industry. It adds costs. It forces millions into pilot projects. Some may pan out, some may not. But I think it's time that we take this opportunity to advance and actually make it more difficult for future administrations to put us in this position again.
Mr. Chairman?
Question.
Representative, thank you. You mentioned the Supreme Court ruling and the Chevron doctrine and your concern about administrations putting us in this position again. What is your opinion on the elimination of the Chevron doctrine?
I believe the Chevron doctrine elimination, I always viewed it as similar to a civil case with prejudice, right? So if you go into a court and you're sued and you can get a ruling with prejudice, they don't come back over and over. The EPA has regularly inched us in a direction because they will put out rules, say 75 new rules this year that no one can attain. We sue them, rightfully with our governor and AGs, they've been great in doing that. We get to a position where it's ruled against the EPA, and the EPA immediately comes out with 75 new rules the next year, and we go through the process all over again. The reversal of that Chevron doctrine, I believe, allows that interpretation that the EPA does not write law that is written by Congress. The EPA is meant to regulate, so it handed that back to the courts to interpret any ambiguity in the laws that Congress has passed. And so that handed that back over to the courts. So I believe it was an issue where the Supreme Court finally said, we're done with this, stop coming back. This is our interpretation. Agencies do not write law.
Thank you. Go ahead, Representative Knapp.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if, with the repeal, I think it's important to know, because I think we'll hear other testimony of what it may or may not do. But with the repeal, it does not prevent the governor's grant and support for new technology. It does not stop the School of Energy work with the ITC, which is up in my county. And the ITC can continue work on technology to find applications for CO2 sequestration. It does not prevent the PSC from applying low carbon emissions to decisions on rate cases. It will not raise costs in the utility-free market, and it will not prevent utilities from still pursuing a CO2 sequestration model for themselves, but it will do it in a free market environment that is voluntary versus mandated. And with that, I will take questions.
Representative Knapp, I have a question. Do we really have the authority to repeal low carbon energy standard requirements? Isn't that federal? We don't have those standards, or maybe we adopted their standards. I don't know, but.
Mr. Chairman, in my opinion, we have somewhat codified those standards in HB 200, which is what I'd be repealing. Those were based off of standards that were created by the EPA. And in a technical form, we somewhat codified those standards. So this would repeal basically what was introduced, I think, by federal tax credits and federal law. But it certainly doesn't repeal federal law. It basically just says that we don't apply those standards to our utilities and force them into a mandated situation.
Yep. Senator Rothfuss.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Representative Knapp's right. This is basically appealing House Bill 200 to a large degree, if not entirely. If you look at the repealers, 3718-101, 3718-102 are the low carbon standards. In Wyoming, with HB 200, the low carbon standards were referring to carbon capture from coal facilities, largely for utilization purposes. So it was a little bit of a different take on low carbon, where other states' low carbon standards are typically renewables. The Wyoming position from HB 200, was that 3 years ago now or 2 years ago? 3 years ago, was trying to take an approach where we focused on carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Mr. Chairman, could I add two more things? So in testimony too, you'll hear that those mandates allowed for CO2 sequestration and also allowed for those companies that would participate in that to apply in their rate increases those costs. Now, it capped it at 2%, and some people would say, well, that's amazing, we got a cap in there of 2%. I would say if a utility company came with an 18% cost increase and was able to add 2% on that because they had maybe a project going in carbon sequestration, that ends up being a cost to the ratepayer on a mandated issue. And we would have a difficulty saying you can't apply 2% because we're the ones that mandated it. So I think that's important. The cost of doing a project can be tens of millions. If that project pans out, the utility would be adding on $500 million to $1 billion through testimony onto a power plant. So that would increase rates as well to the taxpayer or to the ratepayer. So I think that's important to know, is that I don't see that 2% as necessarily a cap, but as a burden onto the ratepayer.
Other questions for Representative Knapp? Other questions? Other questions? Hearing none? Thank you, Representative Knapp.
Thank you.
Nice to see you here.
Nice to see you too.
Anyone else like to speak on House Bill 209? House Bill 209. Identify yourself and carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Randall Luthi. I'm the governor's policy director. And I can actually encapsulate everything in just about 3 statements, but that doesn't mean I will quit after 3 statements. The first is, of course, thank you for the opportunity to talk about HB 209, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about 200 as well. 2, Representative Knapp and I are probably not that far apart. I like to think that I'm taking a little longer view of what we might be able to do, and also give the state time to actually prepare for what we hope is a sea change out of Washington, D.C. when it comes to climate laws. I would urge you to stay the course, at least for the time being. And the third request I would have is you look forward to the interim. We've talked a lot about CO2 this time. Your legislature has talked about it a lot. Maybe it's time to actually sit down as an interim topic and have Minerals Committee look at how we use CO2, where we get it, how we get it to where we want it, and how should it be used. But with that, let me just say I've passed out to you this marvelous presentation. I'm not going to touch very much of it because this is an experienced committee. The House committee, many of them were new, so I thought a history would be of help to them. It may have slowed their decision down about 4 days, but that was about it. But first of all, pages 1 through 5 talk about Wyoming and coal. And I will point out to you all, I am wearing my coal shirt today. All right? Because that's what this is all about. HB 200 was all about coal, how to make coal remain viable in Wyoming and across the nation. I would say let's jump to page 5. That just gives you a little snapshot, of where we are. The fact is, coal production is down because use of coal to generate electricity is down. Part of the good news of that is natural gas has actually replaced much of that, but renewables are also getting more and more of a market. If you look at page 6, you'll see that the change in Wyoming reflects the national trend as well. We use less coal for electricity in Wyoming. Page 7, just the only thing I would note to you is we export about 12 times more energy than we use. We need out-of-state customers to keep our energy market whole. Now, if you go back a few years, on page 8, you'll see many states pass clean portfolio standards, and these are states. Clean portfolio standards generally mean that they're reducing the amount of CO2 they want in whatever fuel they buy. Washington, Oregon were prime examples of that. They are all currently customers of Wyoming Electricity. The federal government jumped in, put as additional restrictions on greenhouse gases, which include CO2. And we just found out consumers were demanding that as well. If you go back about 6 years, you saw utility companies in Wyoming in their integrated resource plans started putting shutdown dates for Wyoming coal plants. And that was a real wake up to you, the members of the legislature. You noticed that. I mentioned on slide 9 the Clean Power Plan. That was thrown out largely by the Supreme Court. But what hasn't changed is EPA said they had the ability to regulate greenhouse gases, that it was an endangerment. It's called the endangerment finding. CO2 is considered a greenhouse gas by CO2. That ruling is still in place. The Supreme Court just in 2023 upheld that EPA could do that. Now, frankly, Administrator Zeldin is re-looking at that endangerment finding. He has submitted his finding to the White House, but we don't know what that is yet. But he was asked to look at whether or not EPA should redo their endangerment finding. But it is still there. And even if they change, I would submit to you through court challenges and many groups that do not want to change, I'm sure we're looking at 2 years before we get an answer on that. Wyoming's response, that starts on page 10. Again, the legislature did things like establish the Integrated Test Center, started to promote coal for something other than just heat. Legislative support for the use and storage of CO2 became, actually established a statewide system of how to manage that as a product. You also passed Senate File 159, talking about before you just shut down a coal plant, you got to offer it for sale. And part of that on page 11 was HB 200. And frankly, the governor took a page out of the renewable portfolio strategy of many of the states to our left. Or our west, I should say. They are saying we want lower CO2. What this bill did says, we want our regulated utilities to look at how you reach lower CO2 standards through the use of carbon capture. The bill never did and does not now mandate carbon sequestration. And sequestration is somewhat of a term of its own, where you actually bury the CO2. H200 concentrated on the utilities, look at it. And that's what it mandated, just to look. And I believe that's what they've done. We talked a little bit, page 12 is actually the one where I'm going to just spend a little more time. And they've done it. They were required to look at it. It did set a cap of 2%. We can argue that. They never did exceed, none of them have exceeded that 2%. It also allowed cost recovery, and the companies could sell CO2 if they wanted to. And that was one of the things, if you just flat out repeal it, those are two things that you'll lose right off the bat. On page 13, you'll see that the amendments, or page 14, I'm sorry, also it's further down, I'm sorry, also gave the PSC the ability to regulate more tightly and more clearly on reliability, not just CO2, but actual reliability. So that, on a flat-out repeal, would remove that as well. It never has had EPA requirements. That was the legislature set that original standard. And then last year, what it did is, if you're going to, when you evaluate carbon capture, evaluate it to the standard that you're going to meet the 45Q. And 45Q standards are what allow certain tax breaks for how you use CO2. And finally, on page 13, you also did energy matching funds. And of course, we litigated. And that's where we are today. I would just point out on page 15, I'm sorry. As we look at the states that we supply coal to, about 18 of them out of the 24, 25 states have some kind of renewable portfolio standard or even zero carbon standards. If they don't change, If our states that we're sending coal to, if they don't change those standards, we have still, if they want our coal, we have to do something to help meet that standard. Carbon capture is one way to do that. On page 15, just an example. I mean, we talk a lot about, well, why don't we just let Wyoming do what we want and generate our own electricity? If all of Wyoming's electricity, if we decided that had to be, supplied by coal, we would need just under 9.5 million tons of coal. Now, according to Wyoming Mining Association, we produced more than 230 million tons of coal last year, 2023. One large mine in Campbell County produced 60 million tons of coal. There just is not enough demand in Wyoming to keep many coal plants alive. Okay, what have we done under 200? And this will be quick. This will be page 17. The companies have evaluated all of their units. The best example I think I can give you is Jim Bridger 3 and 4. I don't believe that utility would have looked at carbon capture without HB 200. They've now determined that that is feasible, that it can be cost effective, and they're moving ahead with FEED studies. We talked about the cost, and you can pass those costs on. And well, anything you do as a utility, normally you pass the costs on the consumer. But they're estimating with the partners that they located through the HB 200 process, that surcharge is now going to be reduced to about 12 cents on a $100 bill. Dave Johnston and Wyodak also looking at a partner. At that plant, they think they can proceed with their pre-feed and feed studies at no additional cost to the consumer. I submit to you that HB 200 is working. Cheyenne Light and Fuel, they've said they're now not going to have another surcharge. Their final plan is due in March. I don't know what they plan to do. The next page is just purely for your information. That's a list of the coal companies, the coal-fired power plants, their retirement date, and those that I've listed in parentheses, those are no longer there. And I would submit to you it's because they have looked at ways to extend the life of those plants. Not maybe completely due to 200, but certainly as a part of it. I mentioned the PSC authority, that would also be lost. So is it still necessary? And I'm on 20 now. I would submit that it is. We have a much better understanding of what we can do with carbon capture. Will it be necessary in 2 years? I'm not so sure. Because if we change at the federal level, the whole part of the playing field changes. However, there are still going to be consumer states that are going to want lower CO2 fuel. I think it just is part of what we should do and continue for the time being. And the last page, 21, just gives you an opportunity if you want to look at how we use CO2. That's my suggestions for an interim study. With that, Mr. Chairman, I was much shorter with you all than I was the House.
Any questions for Mr. Luthi? Mr. Luthi, most of our coal goes out of state, but I don't see anything in here that shows you're saying 24 states. And I guess some of the bigger states might be Texas and a few others. Do we have anything like we have on our own utilities and plant closures and that kind of stuff on our out of state? Because that's what we were trying to save, was we could take care of their carbon sequestration if their emissions only from their plants that we were furnishing coal to.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that. That's an excellent point. Environmental Policy Network is the group that are mentioned in the slides that have actually compiled most of that information. I can get that from them because they were hired and continue to be hired to promote coal, PRB coal. And Mr. Chairman, if I might, you're absolutely right. Technology we develop here can be exported not only to our consumer states, but if we are fortunate enough to go international to the Asian market, there as well. In fact, one of the companies that is a partner is a company of South Korean investors, and they're very interested in seeing what we can do here.
I am, I'm trying to think of the Asian market that we would, are you talking about CO2 that we would capture from them?
No, Mr. Chairman, I would say is the Asian market is still very interested in our coal. But if we export the technology, many of the Asian countries, particularly Japan, have low CO2 standards. And the only way for them to use coal would be be able to use carbon capture in some form or another.
On their own.
On their own.
Yeah, yeah.
But we
yeah.
will share that technology, I'm sure.
Yeah, right, right. Any other questions for Mr. Luthi? Any other questions for Mr. Luthi? Thank you, Randall.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you for
Chairman.
being with us. And thank you for the great document.
I was planning.
I know it. My grandchildren will want to hear it. They sure will. And next up,
I hope you don't have any grandchildren yet that I've missed, Senator Rothfuss. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Mary Throne, Chairman of the Wyoming Public Service Commission. Mr. Luthi covered the main points. I just wanted to highlight a few things. As he said, we've kind of already done a lot of the work under HB 200, or I should say the companies under its jurisdiction have already expended a lot of research dollars analyzing possible carbon capture projects. So with Rocky Mountain Power, we have a final plan in place for them, which means not that they will necessarily build a carbon capture project, but they will continue with a FEED study on Jim Bridger 3 and 4, and then the research projects on Dave Johnston and Wyodak, which I believe all the costs for that research are being paid by others. So the surcharge now for Rocky Mountain Power is just 0.12, 12 cents on a $100 bill. Black Hills has yet to submit their final plan to us, which I think is due at the end of March. And because they were originally doing projects or research jointly with Cheyenne Light and Black Hills Energy, their surcharge has now gone down to 0. And because now the law only applies to Cheyenne Light. We've issued orders on the baseline reliability standards. And as Mr. Luthi mentioned, that portion of the statute would also be repealed. I do want to say that we have always taken the position as a commission that if a project is not economical, we won't approve it. We don't feel like we are mandated to approve an uneconomic project. And as Mr. Luthi mentioned, Rocky Mountain Power's current integrated resource plan finds or has modeled carbon capture on Jim Bridger 3 and 4 as being part of its preferred portfolio, which means they've determined it's an economic source going forward. I mean, we're miles away from seeing that happen. I'm not saying we would ever approve that, but I'm just saying that their initial modeling demonstrates the economic viability of that project.
and Mary, that modeling, was that for coal or for natural gas?
For coal, Mr. Chairman.
Oh. Okay.
And just one other quick item that I just want to remind the committee of. Whatever happens with an endangerment finding under the Clean Air Act, there are a myriad assortment of other environmental regulations under the Clean Air Act that affect coal.
Other questions for the PSC director? Hearing none. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for your testimony.
6 minutes.
We got 6 minutes to deadline cutoff. Can you be quick?
Well, we gavel back in 6 minutes.
Travis, can you do this in
1 minute.
He's always quick.
2:30 or 2:40? 2:30.
2:30.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Travis Detai with the Mining Association.
you know, we're neutral on the bill. We've kind of watched from the outside with Senate File 200 and everything. I think whatever the committee decides to do, we would be okay with. But I want to just talk a little bit about my favorite issue. The sarcasm is hopefully not coming through too hard, about carbon capture. And I really appreciate the bringer of the bill. I understand what his goal is here. And as he made clear, I think this is not an effort to stop our carbon capture and storage efforts at developing that technology at the state level, because the state really is a leader and we want to keep it a leader, whether it's you know, the work at the ITC or the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. The coal industry supports the development of viable carbon capture. As I've testified before this committee before, our three biggest coal companies in the state, some of the biggest companies in the nation, are invested with their own dollars at the School of Energy Resources. So we're in this, and we're in it to win it. And you know, we've got a reprieve. We've got some time, and you know, that's good for the industry. I think we're going to see the regulatory relief that we need at the federal level, in some form. This body, you know, the most important bill you had before you guys passed to give some relief to the coal industry. Thank you very much. It's going to help. And that was the most important bill that you passed this session. And so we've got some opportunities to what we kind of see is, you know, being able to harden up our market, for lack of a better term. Because if we are, you know, the pendulum swings. We've got an opportunity right now to do some stuff. But, you know, as I mentioned before this body before, I think in my time in this business, I've seen 3 permanent majorities in Washington, D.C. The pendulum swings, and it will swing back. So what we've got to do right now is we've got to continue to work the carbon capture effort for emissions, because as Mr. Luthi pointed out, you know, our customers are the utilities, and we send our coal to 25 states. Chairman Anderson, Texas, Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa. Those are our top 4 states. But we also ship coal to Washington, and we also shipped a little bit of coal to California this year, in 2023. But those customers are the utility customers, the ratepayers in some of those states. They're demanding cleaner emissions. And that's not going away. If I could wave my magic wand and make it go away and we could burn coal the way we used to burn it 25 years ago and have all the benefits of affordable, reliable electricity, I would do it, but we can't. But what we can do in the short term right now is continue to develop develop the technology. And I think an interesting statistic I'll throw out, when the Clean Air Act was passed back in the 1970s, I think 1974, you know, since then, when utilities really had to start focusing on criteria pollutants, I mean, real pollutants, whether we can argue back and forth whether carbon dioxide's in there, but you're talking mercury, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter. Since that time, you know, those core emissions have gone down about 97%. And that's been done because of the pursuit of technology. And there's no reason we can't do that with carbon dioxide, but we do need a little time. And again, the industry is supportive of those efforts. And, you know, whether you remove the mandate or not, the committee, agnostic on that. But we don't want to take our foot off the gas on what the state's doing for carbon capture. And, you know, I guess,
right.
Mr. Chairman, that's where I'd stand, and that's right in my testimony,
All right.
and I would stand for comments.
Thank you for your short comments. Any questions for Mr. Deti? Any questions? We are right 1 minute from deadline. Thank you, Mr. Deti. Any other comments from the room? And there are none in Zoom. We will close public comment. And committee, what is your pleasure on House Bill 209? 209. House Bill 209, what is your pleasure? What is your pleasure? Hearing no motion, we will set this aside to be heard from later or not. No motion, no movement. House Bill 81, we will not hear today. Regulatory reduction, we will hear that on next Monday. Right, Sue? All right, with that, we are adjourned. Oh, yeah, take your candy. Sure.